Yes, well, I'm really looking forward to this presentation, and I would like to thank and welcome Kathy Stabilek as our moderator. I guess I met Kathy 3-4 years ago in Vancouver at a TSA meeting, and we had coffee together, and I've gotten to know her more since then. She is Canadian, so welcome to our and living in Seattle, living in Washington State, near Seattle. She is a filmmaker, and we saw her fascinating film at the 2019 WARP meeting in Washington, D.C., her film Threads, and she's an international program consultant. Has a deep interest in textiles and the advancement of artisan enterprise. She's lived around the world while working for the UN in Bangladesh, working for NATO, CARE, and the Canadian International Development Agency, and knows people all over and stays in touch with people all over, which has made her a tremendous resource when we were planning our DC meeting. So thank you, Kathy, and I'll leave it to you.
Thank you very much, Susan. It's just been a real pleasure to know you as well. And I'd just like to introduce a little bit about our panel before introducing our special panelists who come to us from London and from Dhaka, Bangladesh. As we all know, sustainability has been a very common term, a trending topic, and the word means different things to different people. But whatever our definitions, the intentions behind sustainability drive us increasingly as a society toward upholding values that protect our environment and allow people and communities to thrive. But as values shift, individuals and organizations are paying closer attention to the ways of consuming and to business models. Today, we go beyond the buzzword of sustainability and explore how artisanship can be the essence of sustainability and contribute to a new era of caring for planet and people. Our panelists will talk about sustainability from various perspectives, from macro to micro in a sense, from research on artisans globally to a countrywide perspective, and to a case study in developing a social business. Maheen Khan joins us from Bangladesh at a very late hour there, and Sass Brown and Laura Rana join us from the UK. A warm welcome to each of you and to all of you from around the world who are joining us for our discussion. I will introduce each of our panelists before they present, after which time we'll open for a Q&A. So please feel free to write your questions into the Q&A at any time. Sass Brown is our first panelist. Sass was writing about eco-fashion before the concept became widely known. And she's a writer, educator, and activist with 2 books to her name, Eco-Fashion and ReFashioned. I met Sass at Fashion Institute of Technology while she was Interim Dean of FIT's School of Art and Design. She went on to become the founding dean of the Dubai Institute of Design and Innovation, and then senior lecturer on sustainable fashion for Kingston University London. Sass served as a sustainable design advisor to women's cooperatives, educational institutions, government agencies, NGOs, and small and medium-sized enterprises around the world. She recently completed her Ph.D. at Manchester Metropolitan University. Today, we are privileged to be some of the first to hear about her insights from her doctoral research about global artisanship and sustainable development. Over to you, Sass.
Thank you, Kathy. I appreciate the introduction. It's lovely to be here. Let me just share my screen, if I may. Take a second. And then for a minute, you will see my very messy desktop as I try and put this onto full screen. There you go, that should do it. Or it should be coming up in just a second, I hope. Seems to be taking a minute. There we go. All right, so as you said, I wanted to give a really quick overview of my recently completed PhD thesis, which, as Kathy said, was on global artisanship models for the craft sector. So that's operational models for the craft sector. The aims of the research was to evaluate the range and the different types of sustainable development models that work with textile artisanship from around the world, with a view of building a taxonomy of model types, as well as to document and assess the various types of intervention and retention each of those models represent, and to identify best practices that effectively serve to sustain craftsmanship and the people and communities that produce them. So to do that, I undertook 17 case studies across 2 main clusters. 15 of those case studies were chosen to encompass as wide a variety of entities as possible. So they include for-profit, not-for-profit, tiny to huge, national to international, across a really wide geographic representation and a wide variety of different crafts. They're all related to the production of fashion and accessories, however. The second cluster was what I refer to as the Outlier Cluster, and that's 2 entities that support artisans but don't directly produce product. So you can see the list here that shows the diversity of the case studies. The one at the bottom of each of those columns are the outliers, so TEC, Traditional Arts and Ethnology Centre in Laos, and the Ethical Fashion Initiative are the 2 outlier case studies. So to help ensure that diversity of studies that was covered, the entities were all placed into a brand matrix, a pretty standard format for looking at competitor analysis and other things. But the point here was to compare aesthetics and price as the 2 axes on the brand matrix. So you can see value, price point to premium and luxury at one end, and traditional artisanship to the contemporization of it on the other axes. So as part of that categorization, or that process of categorization, it was important for me to identify the overlaps between the brands and the businesses that were categorized. So the most basic of which is the type of entity, for-profit, not-for-profit, or the combination of both of those. And many of the entities I looked at operated in both of those areas. So initially 3 main model types were identified for the theoretical framework on which to build the analysis of the case studies. And so those model types are pretty explanatory in terms of names. So we have skill in position, we have design partnerships, and we have market access. So as they suggest, market access is about giving artisans greater access to global markets. Skill and position is about imposing or teaching training skill sets, and design partnerships is about designers and artisan communities partnering together for product development. Nevertheless, as the research developed, it became really clear there was an enormous amount of overlap between these different silos of information, if you like. And so those 3 model types morphed into effectively 6 model types with the overlap of 2 different models. So very few groups that I studied didn't have more than 1 motivation. So that morphed into the 6 different model types, as we can see. So through that analysis, actually, it became really clear that the single biggest defining characteristic of all of the different entities that I studied was, in fact, the motivation behind their setup, the motivation behind how and what they did. So although those motivations aligned to the entity model types in the previous slide, they were slightly divergent. So the overlaps here actually enabled 7 model types, because we have an additional one where all 3 of those motivations overlap. So while there were brands in the model type mapping that identified with a single type of model or operational model, there were actually none that identified under a single motivational for the development of their entity or of their product. So this is how they mapped out those various case studies, the 15 of them, not including the outlier case studies. So motivation was also determined the various other defining characteristics of the different entities that I studied. So that included values as well as operations. So that analysis was mapped out, and to show that really the interconnected nature of all of that criteria that determined their operational style, their price point, their market suitability, their intervention or levels and types of intervention, with a design intervention, business intervention, etc., levels of respect, whether for artisans or for traditional craft, the motivations behind the business, the scales of the business, the standards or guides, as well as the external impacts. And so you can see here those 3 types, and that developed into an additional total of 6 with the overlapping. So you have market access, which the motivation is to sustain people. The strategies tend to be either direct to consumer, so e-commerce, or wholesale facilitation. The various pros and cons to the different types of model types were outlined. So in the case of market access, it's effectively about reaching as many artisans and supporting as many artisans as possible. And the most suitable market for that type of work was inevitably the gift market, because it necessitated or facilitated greater sales. And that was those different types of models and motivations were mapped into the strategies and the outcomes of the products there. So on slide 9, we can see that this is what I call the external viability criteria. And that was actually developed because it became really clear that there were a number of externalities that directly impact the success, the longevity, the efficiency of the different models and entities that I studied, and that those were criteria that were external to the ability of an entity to control them. So you can see all of the different impacting criteria at the bottom here, that from politics to economy to geography to culture, mapped out to the individual things that impact them. So in terms of skills transmission, some of the challenges are to do with aging practitioners, or to do with documentation of the tradition, or to do with training the next generation, etc. So that was the external viability criteria that got mapped. So all of this various criteria, I'm a designer by training, so I'm a very visual person. For me, it's really important not to have giant spreadsheets of data, but actually to have visually representative information. So I mapped all of that into what I call constellation mapping, to make this overall sort of galaxy of constellations of information. So that you can see in the top left there, you've got the business type constellation, and that's surrounded by the various types of business entities, whether B Corp, benefit corporation, etc. Then on the top right, you have the motivation galaxy, which is surrounded by the different types of motivations for the entity and the different standards that support them. So whether the ILO, the Sustainable Development Goals, fair trade, etc. And then the largest one at the bottom, is the intervention constellation. So that's surrounded by the different intervention types, which effectively drill down to reintroduction, retention, and reinterpretation of tradition. And that's mapped to the external viability criteria, which directly impacts the ability to sustain those businesses. And that in turn to those micro components of the external viability criteria. So that was developed into a taxonomy of models effectively, that incorporated motivations, impacts, the ethics of the entities, and the way that they worked with craftsmanship and craft, and identified the best practices of those various different entities. So to give just a little bit of insight to a few of the case studies that I did, this is Angel Chang, which was one of them. Angel produces a contemporary women's wear collection, which is produced entirely by ethnic minority Mao Dong and Bui tribal people in the Guizhou province in China. Her intention is to help sustain the traditional lifestyles of that community. So specifically lifestyle, not tradition of craft. Craft is one of those components of their lifestyle, but that's not her main motivation. So to create her collection with these ethnic minority communities, Chang really had to work outside of the mainstream fashion industry. So she produces pieces based on the availability and supply of raw materials. And that in turn is dictated by seasonal nature. So the timeline of when certain processes are possible. So it's dictated not by the fashion calendar, but in fact by nature. And she also has to operate a very localized and transparent supply chain. So these are a couple of pieces from her collection. So the producers and the villagers are entirely self-sufficient farmers who use their land to grow the raw materials, to spin and weave the textiles, with the entirety of the garment development done within just a few neighboring villages within that geographic region. So right from growing the fiber to spinning, dyeing, weaving, and sewing the garments. And every single piece in the collection is entirely hand sewn. So just a couple more examples. I realize I'm running a little bit over time. So this is Swati Kalsi. She's a textile and fashion designer based, working with Sujani tradition of embroidery in Bihar, India. And she's really renowned for bringing contemporary relevance to this craft. And she's very well recognized for championing the livelihoods of Indian artisans. And her primary mission is to produce innovative handcrafted work. So based on an existing tradition, but really contemporized. So her investigations are very deep rooted in the discovery and exploration of technique. So these are also pieces from her collection. Each piece is created really from a really highly collaborative process. She only produces 7 items a year, and those items are a collaboration between about a dozen or so Sujani embroiderers who work between 2 weeks and an entire month on a single piece. And so the garments that are produced are museum quality. In fact, they're really collector's items, as opposed to people do wear them, but they're mostly collected by museums or art collectors. So she really walks a fine line between retention of traditional technique and reinvention of material culture, and she does it really particularly well. Last but not actually second to last, we've got the Ethical Fashion Initiative. I wanted to touch on them just because they're an outlier case study. They're actually a co-secretariat of the United Nations Alliance for Sustainable Fashion. So their project is really an industry project, it's a supply chain project, and it's a development project because they come through developmental aid effectively, and it's a means of impacting poverty, utilizing craft as a means of empowerment. So you can see the various locations that the EFI work in, predominantly in Africa, but also Uzbekistan, Afghanistan, Haiti, and Tajikistan. And what they do is they connect the artisan entities and individual artisans, both in the formal and the informal economy, with premium fashion long-term partnership with designers through a social enterprise hub. And these are some of the designers that they work with. So we've got Vivienne Westwood on the right, Vivienne Westwood on the left, Stella John on the right, and you've got Dent Daman, who's one of the African designers that they support. So they're a really radical departure of developmental aid because they facilitate these direct links with the informal economy. And they use craft as the medium to deliver livelihoods in terms of the artisan knowledge sharing. And so their mission is really to connect with long-term premium makers and to develop those business partnerships. And last and not least is Carla Fernandez. And she's a combined for-profit and not-for-profit brand. And she works in Mexico, and she's dedicated to preserving and revitalizing the textile legacy of indigenous communities in Mexico. So she travels all across Mexico to work directly with these various communities, and she applies traditional pre-Hispanic methods in the development of fashion and other products for the sustainment of these communities. So she operates both an NGO and a for-profit, and as in many cases, for-profit helps fund the NGO. And she undertakes the product ideation and development directly with the artisans within their communities. So she uses really tradition and creation as a political tool. And every piece that she produces is really a statement about solidarity and respect for Mexico's indigenous roots, and in opposition to the valorization of imported goods over indigenous traditions. And so she's really believes in the beauty and the tradition of these crafts, and she sees that the haute couture of her country is actually located in the highlands, the mountains, the deserts, and the jungles. So I'll finish with a quote from her, which is that the future is handmade, which really is very much about her perspective on design and the value of tradition and artisanship. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sass. As we can see, artisanship is very complex, and particularly when we overlay sustainability. And so thank you very much for providing us with an overview. And we know you're going to be publishing a little bit more in the future about working with artisans. And we look forward to hearing more about that, perhaps during the Q&A.
Thank you very much.
Maheen Khan, our next speaker, is the founder president of the Fashion Design Council of Bangladesh. She's worked with skill development and income generation of rural artisans for over 36 years. Maheen's career started as a designer with Arong, a social enterprise of BRAC, one of the largest NGOs in the world. With her designs, she focuses on reviving and sustaining age-old crafts with functional modern aesthetics. Maheen's work spans a wide range: jewelry, terracotta, leather, jute, metal crafts, printing, embroidery, and handloom. I met Maheen while she was on an Eisenhower Fellowship in the United States, and it brought back memories of my visits to her studio in Bangladesh, where she continues to work with traditional textile techniques that promote local expertise. Maheen will provide a glimpse into the handloom sector in Bangladesh, the revival of heritage products with sustainability and long-term benefits as a goal, and the contribution of design for sustainability. Over to you, Maheen. I think you're on mute, Maheen. If you could take yourself on mute. And
thank you, Kathy. That was really nice. I really appreciate your comments. I'm very pleased to be here today making a small presentation. I don't want to take up too much time. It's really, you can't really do, you really can't share a lot in 10 minutes, so I'll try my best. A story of hope and sustainable livelihoods in Bangladesh. Why homegrown textile is necessary and crucial step for sustainability. After our independence, master weavers in Bangladesh again found better opportunities in the mid-70s. The real growth in the handloom sector came about with the intervention of BRAC Arong with their large and expanding social businesses. The cotton was locally sourced. The traditional cluster of weavers were identified, bringing back livelihoods. Next slide, please. Thank you. Textile weavers of the handloom sector today are predominantly working in the sari sector. It is our national dress. These handloom saris are woven in the simplest to the most intricate of patterns. Today, handloom materials are also produced for dress goods. This is very encouraging. Thus, handloom provides many jobs rurally. Next slide, please. Skilled woman brings social change. After our war of independence, many women faced dire consequences. They were deserted, widowed, and victims of war. Vulnerable and without shelter, they needed a source of income. Many NGOs came forward to support women-focused programs. The largest and most successful training programs were instituted by BRAC for the poorest landless women. Craft training had its humble beginning with just 12 women in 1977. Today, BRAC employs over 65,000 women in textile-related activities, mostly in embroidery. Rural women who are trained to embroider, dye, tailor, or block print with institutional support are doing much better. These women are working in workshops in their own villages and are supporting their families and improving their life for their future generation, especially the girl child. Next slide, please. The revival of heritage products that has impactful, sustainable long-term benefits. Why benefit from creating a product? We hope the steps taken to produce goods can benefit the earth, water, and air that we consume. Keeping with these objectives in the beginning, most of the product development relied on common sense and availability of resources. Existing looms, but new construction and components, old ways and found materials. The design inspiration was derived from old pieces of saris or heirloom, some documented from museum archives. This not only helped to revive old designs, but also supported the idea of continuity of textile legacy. With each step, ideas were formulated to keep the designs contemporary. Well, what was the need for design studios back then? It came along organically once the organizations understood the need for functional products. From the start, products were design focused for a core target audience, even in a social business model. Next slide, please. Folk art and myths inspires our design culture. Ethical designs uses artisanal work and styles that we understand in principle. The creativity of folk art has given design direction to many textile work. For example, you can see sweet molds with beautiful designs known as shondesh are often used as motifs on textiles, while decorative pots known as shokehari has such brilliance of color, flora, and fauna that it is also very popular for textile prints here in Bangladesh. Woven mats known as shitolpati has received UNESCO recognition as an intangible cultural heritage of Bangladesh. It has rich geometric patterns that are a great source of inspiration for our textiles. The decorative fabrics are hand-woven and each motif has a fantastic lineage of history. Textile is a core tradition here, with silk and cotton saris being woven for over 1,000 years. And Dhaka is the center of our unique heritage. Next slide, please. Evolve ideas through research and documentation. The Jamdani weaves of Dhaka are known as figured muslins, and today various forums are taking initiatives to revive the past glory of this fine textile. The US government's Ambassadors Fund in 2013 was a start and an instrumental support that helped document motifs and create sample stories. Legendary muslin is the precursor to Jamdani. This cloth made of cotton was fit for Roman emperors, woven even 2 millenniums ago. Muslin from Dhaka had been the finest of cloths and extremely soft after. It was shipped and found its way to the far corners of the world. This finest of material was a result of thriving cotton growers in the past who were producing a special variety along the riverbanks near Dhaka. This cotton, Gossypium arboreum neglecta, is known locally as the spectacular Futi karpas. This was hand spun to create threads that maintained a powerful tensile strength at counts higher than any other cotton species. The cloth was gossamer, translucent, and so precious that it was meant only for royalty. Next slide, please. Design intervention to keep things relevant and current. Cotton is the second most important cash crop in Bangladesh after jute. It is the main raw material of the textile industry. Bangladesh primarily grows American upland cottons near Sundarban, a mangrove forest, while tree cotton is grown in 3 southeastern hill districts. Unless more interventions are taken to produce organic cotton, it will be difficult to carry out more sustainable programs here in the future. Textile weaves took center stage during the early 80s by both BRAC and Grameen Bank. These large NGOs ran their missions to provide income generation to rural women through textile work. Handloom checks were developed with design intervention to support the ready-made garment industry. The NGO initiatives, unfortunately, were not very compatible with the ready-made garment sector. However, the local handloom sector received a boost with an array of designs and creative inputs. The success of Bangladeshi sustainable social businesses was founded on design intervention and primarily for income generation for women. All the ideas were developed to connect the buyers locally. People understood artisanal designs and living arts as there was no culture for design. The team of designers led by Shilu Abed, the advisor to BRAC Arong, collectively not only built capacity, but also invested in design and documentation. The landless, poorest, vulnerable women were rehabilitated through training, printing, weaving, dyeing, and embroidery were instrumented for their livelihoods. Next, please. Build collections ethically and advocate for responsible designs. In Bangladesh, homegrown designers are working with different communities of weavers. As a developing nation, we have limited resources to invest in new designs. It is essential for organizations like the Design Council or Craft Council to support artisans with designs much like the government weaving centers in India. The in-depth knowledge of the weavers can be supplemented with new tools, but a successful design can be achieved if design became functional rather than just decorative products. The design solutions are based on a wide network of speculations on future market trends. Our artisanal works consider color, texture, shape, size, and pattern projections that preview future design stories. We believe these draw direction and dialogue that works into the lifestyles of the modern yet very ethical buyer. Next slide, please. Artisanal work must evolve with something innovative for the environment. The world is transforming and adopting new ways to trade and create business for artisan products. The product may be produced in a traditional way, but how to find an audience for this by using technology. Global webs are constantly competing with our attentions. Algorithms are computing our every move. We need to make the product innovative and novel because people get tired easily of the old thing. Invest in inventive and modern designs that add a stronger environmental perspective. The main aim should be to minimize any undesirable environmental effect of the product's life cycle. We understand that the way forward is to remake, reuse, and upcycle the textile products and its components. Consumers are equally responsible today, and they must decide how to add value to the final product. Next, please. Finally, global collaboration and networking. Traditions cross borders, evolves over time, and captivates new cultures. There are many common problems around the world that could be resolved through collaboration and support. In the textile sector, both government and non-government organizations are working to revive and improve the conditions of textile workers. Better sustainable results come with resources generated from artisan communities. Sharing these experiences with vision to rejuvenate green ideas will accelerate programs everywhere. Our one world, one village concept is very relevant and connects the world today. An excellent outcome can be achieved through dialogue. The Khadi Festival, organized by the Fashion Design Council of Bangladesh, is one such annual event. Many regional countries participate with one goal: to take steps to conserve resources, promote handmade products with zero carbon footprint. We welcome you to Bangladesh. Come experience the perfect threading of sustainable fashion and women's empowerment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maheen. As you say, we could talk probably for days about this subject and even just about what you're talking about in Bangladesh, but we are running a little behind, so I will move on to Laura Rana and then we'll come to questions. Laura Rana was inspired to start a social enterprise called Kushikata, or Happy Blanket, by the birth of her half British, half Bangladeshi twin daughters, and her long-standing dream to use everything she's learned from 12 years in working in the international development and humanitarian sectors in Bangladesh. Her vision is to create opportunities for other mothers to provide for their children with dignity by hand-stitching baby blankets from reclaimed and ethically sourced cotton, while staying true to the recycle, repurposing foundations of Kata textile traditions of the Bengal region. Since being introduced to Laura by a Bangladeshi friend over a year ago, I have followed her journey of establishing a social enterprise during the COVID period, while having sustainability and transparency as her guiding principles and staying strictly as possible to those. Being true to these principles has been very complex. I thank her for her bravery to share her experiences with us as she sets out with an ambitious goal to blend sustainability and handcraft, to bring rich heritage textile traditions to a wider audience while navigating the world of modern tastes and regulatory frameworks. Over to you, Laura.
Well, firstly, I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of the panel. It's a real honour, particularly the stage I'm at in my journey. I'm obviously very much the new kid on the block as part of this panel. But yeah, hopefully I can share a little bit of my experience, and it might be useful to some of you who are maybe trying to do similar things. And particularly some of the challenges I've had and some of the tensions around trying to make every decision with sustainability at the forefront. So I'm going to explain a little bit about what sustainably means to Kushikata, which translates as happy blanket. If I could have the next slide, please. Basically, our mission as a social enterprise is to build better futures for the next generation. And we see that as there's sort of two key lenses to sustainability. So we see sustainability very much as a actually three key lenses, I guess I would say, very much as a multifaceted concept, which I guess probably chimes with a lot of what the other presenters have been talking about. So my professional background is in the international development and humanitarian sector. And I've been working for about 14 years all over the world, a lot particularly in Bangladesh, but in quite a few other places as well. So I first moved out to Bangladesh in 2009 to work on a big budget donor funded anti-poverty program. And I met my now husband in the first week or two, and so I've kind of lived there on and off ever since. And I guess one of the things that has struck me about my experience is that when it comes to trying to lift people out of poverty or help people to lift themselves out of poverty in terms of kind of a long-term sustainable approach, then a charity, donor-funded, grant-based approach doesn't work when you're trying to break this intergenerational transmission of poverty. So that's why we've chosen a social enterprise model. And our goal is to create opportunities for mothers in Bangladesh to provide for their children with dignity. So that's at the center of what we're trying to do. So I guess kind of for us primarily, or that the most sort of obvious or kind of foremost form of sustainability is around economic sustainability for the mothers that we're partnering with at the individual level, at the household level, and then at the broader community level. But we also very much look at sustainability as well through an environmental lens. And then coming back to what I was saying around the model, financial sustainability as an organization, so not being dependent on, we have accepted a couple of grants actually very gratefully to kind of help us get started, but not being dependent on donor funding and on grants, and especially thinking about scalability. So if we want to be able to provide sustainable income generation opportunities for a significant number of mothers, we're going to have to sell a certain number of our blankets every month. And then I guess also you could think of sustainability as a sort of a cultural sustainability. So one of the other things that we're trying to do, and again, I don't think we're unique in trying to do this, is celebrate a beautiful Bangladeshi tradition that I'm going to talk a little bit more about, but we're also sort of reworking and regenerating it so that it can hopefully reach a wider audience. If I can have the next slide, please. So my half British, half Bangladeshi daughters were born in the summer of 2019. They're just about to turn 2. And I'd spent the first half of my pregnancy working on the Rohingya refugee response in a place called Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. So as you may know, nearly 1 million men, women and children fled across the border from Myanmar to escape human rights atrocities. And they were living, well, they still are living in a series of refugee camps. And one of the things I was most struck by in the year that I spent over there was the resilience and the generosity of the local mothers. So this is the mothers from the Bangladeshi host community, who were, that area is actually one of the poorest parts of Bangladesh. And a lot of them, they were struggling to feed their own children, but I found they were still, they'd be donating vegetables, for example, to Rohingya families because they were worried that the children weren't eating enough nutritious food. And again, I think this was, as I said, not the first time I'd been in Bangladesh. I've been living there on and off for about 12 years now. And I've had a long-standing dream to use everything I've learned from all the different types of work I've been doing there to support other women whose position I could easily be in myself. And as I said, these women who have this incredible resilience and strength and will literally do everything they can to try and provide the best possible futures for their children. But I guess over the years, I didn't quite have an idea of what I was going to do. And then when my daughters were born, they were gifted a large collection of traditional kata blankets. So you can see them in the middle slide, which were lovingly hand stitched by my mother-in-law and my sister-in-law with support from the local community. We were given about 40 of the blankets, and I was initially overwhelmed to receive so many, even with 2 babies. It seemed like a lot of blankets, but I soon realized how incredibly useful they could be for all sorts of things beyond just being used kind of in the pram and the cots. I used them as a cover when I was breastfeeding. We used them as like mini play mats. I used them as a sunshade to kind of line the Moses bucket, like basically everything on your daily to-do list as a mother, we were using the blankets for. And everywhere I was going, the vibrant colours and the striking cutted stitching were drawing compliments. And finally, I realised that there could be a market for them. And this is how I could go about trying to create opportunities for the mothers in Bangladesh that I wanted to support. And I was very fortunate. When my daughter was about 3 months old, I applied to an incubator, social enterprise incubator that's linked to the business school at Cambridge University. And I was really lucky to be accepted onto that. So for the past year or so, I've been getting some brilliant mentoring and training and support and kind of access to their networks to help make my vision a reality. If I could have the next slide, please. So as I was saying at the beginning, so Kushi Kata, which translates as happy blanket. Kushi is the Bengali word for happy. And kata, which translates as stitched cloth, refers to this beautiful Bengali tradition that many of you may be familiar with, of repurposing old cotton saris into these super soft. So because they're cotton that's been washed so many hundreds of times, it's really, really soft. And the blankets are multi-layered. So basically mothers will stitch together multiple layers of their old saris into these beautiful blankets for their babies, and stitch this simple embroidery stitch, but they can make all sorts of beautiful patterns with it. And so this is the tradition. And I mean, I even before I had the girls, I had lots of these the larger cutter blankets that you can use like on on the bed as a throw on the sofa. But my initial customer research made me realize that I wouldn't be able to use secondhand saris, both in terms of customer perception around sort of hygiene and safety, particularly given the current pandemic context. And then as I started to do more sort of concrete research into product safety laws and things, and speak to some of the leading global safety testing companies, I realized that, so I guess it's a kind of a long, complicated story, but basically the core of the issue is that because I'd be collecting the sari secondhand, I wouldn't be able to trace the origins of the dyes that's in the fabric. Which means I wouldn't be able to get this certification that the fabric was safe for babies without safety testing every single sari, basically, which wasn't going to be logistically or financially feasible. Basically, I realized I had to rework the approach a little bit. So if I could have the next slide, please. But I very much wanted to retain the circular principles of reclaiming and repurposing and reusing fabric. So again, it's been a long story, and if anybody's interested, I can definitely like have a conversation. But ultimately, what I've ended up doing is partnering with sustainably minded members of the Bangladeshi garments industry to upcycle what's known as dead stock cotton fabric to form the inside layers of our blankets. Because it was originally intended to make garments to sell on the global market, then it has all the certifications that are needed anyway. And then for the outside layers of the blankets, so we're using new fabric rather than repurposing old fabric, but we're using traditional handloom fabric that's dyed using eco-friendly dyes. Basically, it means that we're then working with another artisan community and sort of celebrating and bringing to a wider audience another beautiful Bangladeshi tradition. Slide, please. So basically throughout the journey so far over the past, well, my daughters are nearly 2, and I pretty much started working on it around when they were born, so like nearly 2 years. I guess I've come to face a lot of tensions in terms of thinking about as I said, like making every decision with sustainability in mind, and this is when it comes to sort of the multifaceted nature of sustainability, and that some of the different lenses of sustainability are maybe a bit at odds with each other. So we've ended up, you can see in the slide the 4 different embroidery designs that we're offering at the moment, and they basically represent a cultural fusion. So we've taken some traditional Bengali animal motifs, but then we've blended them with geometric patterns, and I guess the color palette is kind of quite contemporary. And so, yeah, I guess that would be one question around, if we're saying we're sort of celebrating a cultural tradition, the fact that we're bringing in some Western design elements could be sort of a question that I've certainly asked myself. And then in terms of the embroidery patterns themselves, I guess obviously we're working with these incredibly talented artisans. Like my first instinct would be, well, shouldn't we give them free rein when it comes to the design? And they should, they should be able to kind of choose whatever designs they want. But for now, my feeling is no, because actually it's more important, especially as we're getting established, to, as the heading of this slide says, give the people what they want, if that's not too much of a crude way of putting it. So we're focusing on the embroidery patterns and the colorways that our target customer research has shown to be the most popular. Because basically, if we can't start to sell enough of the blankets kind of on weekly or monthly basis, we're not going to be able to create any kind of sustainable income opportunities, and yeah, kind of get the whole thing off the ground. And that's the core of what I'm trying to do. And yeah, I've seen various well-meaning initiatives, I guess, in my years of working in Bangladesh and other countries around the world fail to gain traction, because they have like a similar vision to me. Again, I don't think what I'm doing is sort of particularly unique and original, but there ultimately ended up not being enough demand for the products that they're selling. And I want to sort of that people want in their own right, and sort of the sustainability angles, so both environmental and in terms of creating opportunities for mothers in Bangladesh. That's kind of I don't know if a secondary consideration is the right word, but certainly they need to want to buy them in their own right. And to do that, we're going to be able to, we're going to need to sell the going to be able to opportunities for we're partnering with to earn sustainable incomes month out. If I have the next slide, please. So another, I guess, like one of the core dilemmas I've been facing is about how much we should pay the women, and what do we mean by a living wage, and also how should we pay. So obviously, ultimately, what I'd love to be able to do is offer, you know, when we talk about sustainable, reliable income, which is really important in terms of women and households, to be able to make the kind of decisions that lift households out of poverty in the long term. So things like sending children to school rather than out to work, then it's not even so much about how much they're earning every month, but the fact that they're earning a reliable income, you know, they know they're going to get a certain amount every month. So ultimately, I'd love to be able to offer a salary rather than a piece rate, and then, you know, things like health insurance and childcare and all the other elements that represent sort of what can be known as decent work. But again, for now, you know, I'm not in a position to be able to afford to do that. And I don't, one of the last things I want to do is to kind of set up expectations among the mothers that I'm partnering with that we won't ultimately be able to make. To meet, sorry. And then in terms of how much we should pay, I guess my first instinct was like, well, let's figure out the maximum that the customers will pay for the blanket, subtract all the other costs, and then all the rest goes to the women. But again, you know, drawing on my extensive experience of working in these kind of communities in Bangladesh and also in other countries, if I was to sort of waltz in as a foreigner and be paying, you know, like a massive multiplier of the local wage rate, particularly to start with, we're only going to be able to work with sort of 5-6 mothers. It's going to cause lots of trouble in terms of, sort of disrupting the local economy, you know, cause trouble for the women. So it didn't seem like the right thing to do. So basically, I've been doing some research because Bangladesh is the home of the garments industry. There's been obviously, you know, a big spotlight around salaries, wages, and so I've been looking at some research around the living wage and what constitutes a living wage, and taking that methodology, and it's basically based around local living costs. And so the village that I'm working with in northwest Bangladesh, the living costs are quite different compared to where most of the garments factories are situated. And yeah, basically trying to calculate a living wage based on that. And then obviously, because I can't offer a monthly salary at the moment, then calculating, sort of extrapolating that to an hourly wage, and that's how we're going to be setting the wages. But also trying to understand what else the mothers really value. So one thing that's really important, obviously, particularly at the moment, is the fact that they're able to work from home, as opposed to, you know, having to go out to work, and that the work can be flexible around looking after their children and their other household responsibilities. And also thinking beyond the household level. So we're going to be reinvesting profits into the communities, but in line with the priorities of the mothers. So what they value in terms of improvements that we can make at the community level, and trying to take things one step at a time, and, you know, not kind of waltzing in and promising the earth and not being able to deliver on that. If I could have the next slide, please. So yeah, I mean, really common when you're trying to do something like this, particularly the stage that I'm at, but just a few more kind of key questions to raise. So one is, what does empowerment really mean? Obviously, so my background actually is in impact measurement. That's what I do in terms of sort of in the NGO sector. So I guess my brain naturally goes towards sort of defining things and measuring things, and empowerment is something that can mean different things to different people. And then, as I said, like, should we even be using this term anyway? I know that a lot of people don't like the term because they think of it as sort of othering, and, you know, empowerment is something you do to other people as opposed to something that people can do for themselves. But for me, so partly I'm using a tagline embroidered with empowerment for the blankets that seems to be going down quite well. And for me, what's important is that whatever term we're using, it's defining it in a way that means something to the mothers that we're partnering with. And so I'm going to be using a participatory impact measurement approach, where I'm really trying to understand what empowerment means to the women in terms of like economic empowerment, but also socially. And again, empowerment, like sustainability, is a multifaceted term. And then so we can look at measuring our social impacts in those terms, but also that can help in terms of decision making, and kind of where we place emphasis in terms of the decision making around sustainability, and kind of where we're investing profits and things. Another big question was around personalization. So again, for baby products particularly, there's a real trend towards personalization. A lot of people kind of expect it, particularly with sort of a small business, kind of handmade sort of thing like I'm trying to do. It's sort of that the standard thing to offer, but it also seems to sort of go against the very essence of sustainability, because obviously we want the blankets to be passed down from child to child, whether that's to a sibling or a friend or other children in the community. Also, it's what the market demands. So it's going back to what I was saying about if we can't manage to sell enough blankets to sort of establish things and meet our core mission, then I guess a lot of the other questions around what's like the ultimate right thing to do, sort of theoretically or on paper, become a little bit obsolete. And then a third question is around shipping. So people have said, well, if you're so like ethical, sustainable, particularly like from an environmental perspective, but then you're shipping the blankets from Bangladesh, kind of raising questions around that. So I mean the sort of, I guess, first port of call is around carbon offsetting, and I'm looking into that at the moment, and we're calculating our carbon footprint and looking at different offset schemes, but it seems that we should ideally be going beyond that. So I'm trying to kind of understand and think about other things that we could be doing, because some people have also said, oh, why aren't you working? There's a big British Bangladeshi community in the UK, and a lot of those are marginalised. Why aren't you working with British Bangladeshi women? You're based in London, like, why aren't you doing that? But then if you think about what a living wage is like the London living wage, and then you multiply it by the number of hours it takes to make the blankets, yeah, the price would not be something that people are paying. Or you could say, okay, well, why aren't we shipping using boats rather than by air, for example? But the amount, the size of the shipment that you need to be able to ship by a ship as opposed to air freight, and then also the amount of time that takes, and again, loads of other kind of logistical factors. So yeah, I'm waffling a little bit, and I'm going to wrap up now, but basically I just wanted to give a few insights into sort of our journey so far, and some of the big questions that we've been grappling with. So if I could have the final. Yeah, so this is it. Just if you want to know more, I've just put our social media handles and our website link, and then the image on the left of the slide is just a screenshot of our blog homepage. So that's where I've tried to sort of capture our journey so far and some of these thoughts and questions and how we've been dealing with them so far. And I've just put the links to some of the key blog posts that particularly speak to some of these sort of ethical questions around sustainability. Yeah, and very much welcome people's thoughts, questions, criticisms, ideas about how we could be doing things differently. And yeah, to say thank you once again to Kathy and to Warp and everybody else. It's a real privilege to be a part of the panel, so thank you very much.
Thank you. So just wrapping up, because I just want to summarize a little bit because of the difficulties in hearing Laura, but the considerations that she was taking was, looking at a tradition and that's very well known in Bangladesh, and being inspired by so many people creating these types of kanta blankets, and seeing an opportunity to create employment and an export market for these in the UK, and then really drilling down into sustainability elements and seeing how those could be recreated to respond to customer demand. So using upcycled dead stock fabric for the inside layers and traditional hand loom fabric for the outside layers, and then really looking into what to fairly pay the women. So there's a lot to be learned from her case study, and I'm sure anybody that wants to connect with her later certainly can do that. So I'm just going to look through the chat here. Thank you very much, Lara. I'm just going to look through the chat and see if there are any questions here. please start to put your questions into the chat. But perhaps I could start off by picking up on something that Sass was mentioning, and also asking Maheen with respect to training. And Sass mentioned, passing on to the next generation, and encouraging youth to develop these skills. Perhaps, Sass, could you just briefly talk about maybe a model or two of training that you saw, and then Maheen, if you could chime in about training of artisans in Bangladesh. Thank you. Sass?
Sure. There were a number of entities that I know of or have worked with or have studied that have different training initiatives. The challenge in general with tradition is, of course, the continuation of that knowledge base, especially when you're talking about a developing nation where the values of the West are imported, and there are many push factors that push those communities to leave their community or their country to earn or gain a better living. So those are part of the challenges. That's one thing in particular that the EFI work with, because it's a United Nations flagship program. They're very concerned and work with those push factors, which relate to those external viability criteria, because often they're political, they're to do with warfare, they're to do with access to water, to jobs, etc., etc. So there are lots of means of impacting those push factors, which are to do with improving economic opportunities in general, not specific to artisanship, the elimination of conflict, etc. There has certainly been entities that have worked to document the process. Threads of Life was one of the entities that I studied for the case studies, and they work with reintroduction of traditions that have been lost in Indonesia. So part of their process is the documentation and the rediscovery through partnerships of those traditions that have been lost. Some cases they're still retained by an elder within a village. In other cases, they've been completely forgotten. So it's about trying to reestablish those roots and about rediscovering them, and then creating some form of format or strategy that encourages the continuation of it. I've worked with women's cooperatives in Brazil, for example, in the favelas there, and the motivation for them was partnering with designers and seeing their product alongside of major luxury brands in a Vogue Brazil. That was the impetus for them to say, you know what, there is a future in this. There's something that I aspire to. Certainly funding and to do with paying artisans fairly and giving them an opportunity to continue their traditions, and it being a viable means of them earning a living is another means. There have been collaborations with universities. The Donna Karan, for example, with her Urban Zen line through DOT in Haiti, which was part of the Clinton initiative, and which actually the EFI also work with in Haiti, is about partnering design students with artisans. There you're talking about less heritage craft skills, however, and the impetus is about giving opportunities to better the standards of living, to sustain a living rather than continuing a tradition. So we're back to what's the motivation? Is it to sustain people? Is it to sustain craft?
Right. And sometimes it's both. Yes. Yeah. So thank you, Sass. Maheen, you talked about design, the importance of design and working with artisans, but this year is the 50th anniversary of Bangladesh becoming a nation, and a lot of the design creativity that has come through over those years in employment generation programs. But to what extent is the creativity of the artisan coming forward over all of these decades, and how much is design intervention still needed in the creation of the sort of artisan context in order to make sure that it is sustainable? Maheen?
Yes, thank you, Kathy. So, we've always had very design-focused development work. In Bangladesh, living arts, which is non-textile products like the woven mats that has received UNESCO recognition, or our painted crafts, or our terracotta, which is the one of the most important craft of Bangladesh is terracotta. Those have kind of evolved with artisanal creativity, because it is living arts, it is a lifestyle, it is kind of inherent, clusters of artisans working in communities, in groups, in unison. They work together as communities and develop, the potters, but in the weavers as well. I think a lot of the weavers have been able to develop their work because there's a very good demand of cotton saris. Basically, the hand-woven sector is kind of getting a lot of impetus from NGOs, from small entrepreneurs. People are really looking at handloom. We're all looking at handloom right now because we know it's more durable, it's more comfortable. A lot of the cotton is being sourced locally, but we only produce about 3% of cotton, of what we need, not a lot. So we need to really, invest in that. But at the same time, I think, like I was, in my presentation, I talked about Jamdani, where the master weavers kind of had, work together with disciples who they work, in teams, and the master weavers who it's all verbal, the techniques are verbal, the documentation is done verbally, but we were able to document, with some of the older masters, and, over through documentation from VNA and other, textile museums, we've been able to kind of revive many of the old motifs as well. And it is important for us because we don't have enough documentation. So it is important for us to not only have verbal, skills that has evolved verbally, but also to have, documented design elements that we can kind of pass on to the next generation. So we are working on that. But I think there's a lot of potential in Bangladesh for handloom. There is another big cluster in Shirajganj. There are about 800 weavers who do our sarongs, the men lungi, the lungi are all handloom.
Yes.
And also our gamcha, which is it's like a multi-purpose, scarf, really. We tie it around our head, we wear it around our neck, we use it as a towel. It's a multi-purpose scarf, which is very, very popular. That is also handloom. And there's growing, the handloom sector is growing. But at the same time, there are huge powerloom factories in Bangladesh that has come up to meet the demand. It is organically grown. So, it's all happening at the same time, but I'm very, very encouraged by the fact that there is such a lot of interest in handloom.
Yes, and I think globally, as people gain more interest and purchase handloom and other handcraft, then ideally this will help to build the value of handcraft and encourage more people to learn the handcraft. one of the fellowship students yesterday, a young fellowship student, was saying, that he's now, was sort of a little bit embarrassed to say that he was working with weaving, and now people are very interested in learning this and giving respect to this. So there's a question here for Laura, which I'll move on to, and we do have permission from the WARP administrator here just to go over time just a little bit today. So I just want to ask Laura what stage your project is at now. And you mentioned earlier much of money being given to local projects. You were sort of wondering about that before you, I think it was the effectiveness of money given to local projects before you started your own business. So could you answer the question about what stage your project is at now and shed some light on that, please? Laura?
Yeah, so we just ran a crowdfunding campaign to try and generate pre-orders. So we've got about 120, 130 orders. And so we're just in the process of, basically in a nutshell. And just what I was saying in terms of the money being given to local projects, again, I'm kind of generalizing, but my experience over, the number of years I've been working across a number of different development projects, I guess grant-based approaches to income generation and trying to take women and families and communities out of poverty don't end up for me being the most effective use of money in terms of sustainably lifting people out of poverty if they're not kind of taking a market-based approach. But again, I'm probably being quite simplistic in the interest of time and everything else.
Yes. And Sass, would you mind just telling us a little bit more about what you have in mind for publications or sharing knowledge further to your research?
Sure. I've effectively left writing commercially during the PhD. Inevitably, that took so much focus. So I'm in the process of just at the beginning stage of writing a new book, just on this one specific to artisanship and craftsmanship. I will relaunch the website, which effectively got archived, Eco-Fashion Talk, a number of years ago. But specific now with a focus on artisanship. It'll come under the title of Clothing Ethics, although I don't have a launch date for it yet. It's the same name that I use on Instagram and on my Twitter handle. So that the intention is to take the outcome of the research and to effectively make a how-to guide, a Prince's Trust, if you will, a toolbox of materials to help guide designers or existing brands on ethical means of supporting them working with artisans. So as an interactive guide, as opposed to a printed or a website, but actually an interactive guide that prompts you to take you to the next level. So using those constellations and galaxies as a means to prompt the next level of questions and research that someone would have to undertake to be able to effectively support the development of product within a particular community.
Excellent. Well, please keep us posted at WARP as well when that comes out, and we can, keep in touch with everybody about that. And just, I want to take the liberty of 1 minute, Maheen, but because Bangladesh is one of the, highest producers of ready-made garments in the world, and you've been working in the handcraft sector for all of these years, do you see that there's been any cooperation between the ready-made garment industry and the handcraft sector, or what are the possibilities for that? Or do the two operate in distinct silos?
So, Kathy, that's a very, a very good question, because we've had, like I said, Grameen Bank and BRAC tried to produce, integrate the two sectors by developing large-scale handloom checks, quite like the Madras checks in the mid-80s. And it didn't work out. They were not interested. We are not as, efficient as Indian weavers, and our tools and our handloom sector is a little more archaic. In those days. We have improved over the years, but we were slower, and so our overheads were a little higher. But these NGOs are very highly reputed, and we do give fair wages to artisans, and so the price factor is so important for the RMG sector. Every penny counts, and it's like it's so like cheap and fast fashion, has killed my country. We are becoming a big factory, everywhere you go, you'll find factory after factory after factory after factory. I mean, we are not connected with the RMG sector. We are, completely working in a parallel, very small. We are, minuscule in volume of work that we do compared to these mega composite mills that Bangladesh has. And they are also becoming more and more compliant, and they are looking at ways of regenerating, environment-friendly ideas, but we are not compatible at all. And the garment sector has never helped us, they've never been very kind to us or supported us, because we are struggling. We've been struggling over the last 30 years. We are improving very slowly. I mean, the pace of development is slow. As you know, these are very slow, industries, very slow fashion, slow textiles. Our our mulberries are wiped out because China, it's cheap Chinese mulberry and cheap Chinese yarns have come into Rajshahi, where it is our, silk weavers are working for generations, 1,000-year history going back to the Sultanate of Murshidabad. It's right adjacent to Murshidabad, and we've, always grown our own silk. And that is also in a dying industry. But I think there is interest, but we're not getting a lot of help.
Yes, well, I think now globally there's a lot of discussion about fast fashion. Everyone is very concerned about employment in handcraft, in ready-made garment as well. And as fast fashion, if it does wane, then there will be need for creation of opportunity in other sectors, particularly for women. So I think, as everyone's working in every country to try and develop the artisan sector, there are things we can learn from each other from other economic sectors. And I think as the market becomes more aware, consumers become more aware, I have hope that we will see a lot more interest in sustainable fashion, as we've been talking about today. So I'll just wrap up by saying, in preparing for this session, it struck me how many people in this world at this moment who are really struggling and living with uncertainties of COVID, political and economic challenges that seem so far away from, our conversations in a sense together. And, yet it struck me that these discussions that we have and the actions that we take, the decisions that we take every single day truly make a difference. So, Artisan Enterprise is the second leading employer in the developing world and provides opportunities, particularly for women. So we really can learn a lot from artisanship about the essence of sustainability and the creation of beauty for well-being, slow contemplation, work that can be done in a village, it can be done in a city, the art of craft that doesn't separate families in its making, and of work that connects people within and beyond borders. And we are each of us part of this hope. So I thank you very much, all of our panelists and all of those listening in today and participating. And thank you to the WARP team for bringing us all together.